like to begin. We know that today we are mourning the loss of the Beit HaMikdash. We are mourning really many tragedies that took place over the millennium. And it's interesting, and Rosh Shimshon Pincus points out that when we mourn something, it means there's like a death, right? When else do we have a concept of mourning? When there's misa, when there's death. Other than that, you don't have the idea of mourning. So what is death, and what are we mourning that is sort of similar to the concept of death? So Shimshon Pincus says that death is the disconnect between the body and the soul, the neshama and the guf. And when there's a disconnect between the body and the soul, we see in our life death. And we mourn that the neshama is not with us anymore. And we mourn that the body doesn't have the ability to do the zechut and mitzvot that it once had. What are we mourning today with the loss of the Beit HaMikdash? What I'm going to speak about in the next few minutes is what we're really mourning is the disconnect between us, the Jewish people, and our neshama, our soul, our collective soul, our connection to Hashem, to spirituality, to Kedusha, that makes us feel totally connected. And that is the underlying theme behind all the tragedies that befell the Jewish people throughout all time. In the beginning of Eicha, Yirmiyahu Hanavi says, Eicha yoshva levad, how we're sitting alone. And it actually compares the mourning of the Jewish people to a zonah, to a prostitute. And it's interesting because a prostitute, it might seem like she has many connections, but there's really no connection to anything. We say Jerusalem, Yerushalayim, was Ir Shechuvra La Yachdav, a city that connected us all together. When we mourn the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, the two Beit HaMikdash that happened on this day, and many other sufferings and tragedies that happened to the Jewish people throughout our history, we also must mourn how many millions and millions of Jews we lost to intermarriage, to assimilation. And in a way, this is the quiet tragedy, because we don't feel the pain in like a stab, a wound. And it happens very slowly, or sometimes not so slowly. But millions and millions of Jews have been lost, in particular in the last century or two, to intermarriage and assimilation. I don't know the exact statistic, but all you have to do is look around and speak to people who are observant Jews today, and there's an extremely high proportion of them that are descendants of people that came after the war, Holocaust survivors, immigrants that came to the United States in the last 40, 50, 60 years. There were 2 million Jews in New York, in America, and primarily in New York, in the year 1900. I'm scared to see the statistic of how many of their descendants are let alone observant, but even Jewish. At the end of the first Beit HaMikdash, the 10 tribes got split up from the 2 tribes. And basically, at the Churban of the Beit HaMikdash, at the Churban of the first Beit HaMikdash, we lost 10 out of the 12 tribes. Lost. The Maharal mentions that the word mitzvah, the root of the word comes from the letters tzadik, vav, tes. What does tzadik, vav, tes mean? So it means a connector, a connection. Actually, in modern Hebrew, the word tzava, or the word like for the army, or the word for a company, has the same root. When we do a mitzvah, we are connected to something far greater than ourselves. And the Sfas Emes points out that the word chet is actually connected to the word of disconnect. We all know the famous Ma'amar Chazal that tell us something which on the surface seems very strange. What was the first tragedy that happened on Tisha B'Av? The Meraglim, the spies. They came back to Israel. They told the Jewish people, it's terrible, you can't go there, it's a land that eats up its inhabitants, all these problems. Everybody cried. They didn't follow Yoshua and Kalev, they cried. And the Ma'amar Chazal says, like a message went out that says, you cried for nothing, so this is going to be a day when you cry forever. And on the surface of this, and I was listening to a shir by Rabbi Y.Y. Jacobson who just pulled it out very beautifully, and he said, does this make any sense? Can you imagine? We know that Hashem is our Father, our loving Father who loves us and cares for us. Can you imagine if your parent would say, because you made a mistake today, on this day, forever, you're going to suffer? It sounds terrible. What does this mean? And the answer is that it's not a punishment, it's a consequence. The very problem that caused us as a Jewish nation to sin at the time of the spies is the very reason why we lost the first Beit HaMikdash and the second Beit HaMikdash and all the tragedies that we suffered. When you go back to the first sin recorded in the Torah, it's the sin of Cain and Hevel. Right? Cain kills his brother Hevel. The first sin. How does a brother come to kill another brother? And why did he kill him? There was no shortage of real estate back then. Why did he kill him? The Torah tells us because he was jealous that his karban, his sacrifice, was accepted faster than Cain. Now think about this for a moment. You're killing out 50% of the world's population, and you're doing it because his karban was not accepted. Your karban was not accepted? Does this make any sense? Who are you bringing the karban to? It makes no logical sense whatsoever. And in essence, the sin of the Meraglim, of the spies, also makes no logical sense. God took them out of Egypt in the most miraculous ways. A maidservant at the sea saw more miracles than Yecheskel ben. They're living on man. And then they're saying, oh, we don't trust that God's going to be able to take us into the land of Israel. It doesn't make sense. And the only way to understand it is that at some very deep level, there was a disconnect. There was a disconnect that caused this fear. A disconnect of their bodies and their souls. A disconnect that we're going to speak about in the next few minutes. And it's interesting that it was the sin of the Meraglim, the sin of the spies, that caused them not to go into the land of Israel, that we refer to as the day of suffering, that all suffering is going to be connected to. Not the sin of the golden calf. It seems like the golden calf, as much as it affected them as a nation, it brought them back to mortality, but yet that they could have overcome. But the sin of the spies, that's the prototype sin. That's the sin that in a certain sense is the connector or the source, the root of all the galut and all the problems that we have today. If you think about it, the sin of the golden calf came about, commentaries say they wanted something tangible, they wanted a tangible way to connect to God. Some say it was fear because they saw Moshe Rabbeinu, it looked like he had died. But at the root of it, it came from certain ideas that were wrong. But the sin of the spies was a sin of what we're going to discuss as total disconnection. There's a very famous pasuk in Parshat B'chukotai, in the middle of what we call the tochacha. The tochacha is the curses, the negative things that will happen to the Jewish people if they don't follow the mitzvot. And in the middle of this whole tochacha, of all the negative things that will happen, there's a very strange verse that just jumps out in the middle of it that really doesn't seem to fit at all with the rest of the tochacha, and it's very strange in general. And the verse is, Tachat asher lo avadata Hashem Elokecha b'simcha u'b'tov levav me'rov kol. And the way most commentaries explain this is that you take the words literally. Why did all these bad things happen? Tachat asher lo avadata Hashem Elokecha b'simcha u'b'tov levav me'rov kol. Because you didn't serve God with simcha, with happiness and a full heart. As Rashi says, at the time when things were still good. When things were still good. And it's a very strange pasuk. First of all, it's strange that the Torah is in the middle of the Tochacha telling us why we got to this point. And it's strange that this is the very reason why all these bad things happen. I think if you ask most of us, we would say it happened because of Yetzer Hara, because of Ta'ava, because we had desires to do the wrong thing. That's not what it says. It says it happened because we didn't serve Hashem with simcha and a full heart when things were good. Why is simcha so important? What is the importance of simcha that it gets such prominence over here? And I want to share with you something that I personally, for myself and my family, I call it the miracle in Mumbai. It's going to be 10 years now, the Wednesday night before Thanksgiving. I'm walking out of my office, and I'll never forget this, Lineda. I'm walking out of my office, and my wife calls me, and she says, "Is your father okay?" And I said, "Why would he not be okay?" And she said, "My mother called me and said that there was an attack in India." And I didn't even remember that my father was in India, but he traveled there often at that time for the cancer research that he was doing. And I flippantly responded, "India is a big place, 1 billion people. What's the likelihood that he was involved, even if he is there?" 10 minutes later, I get a call from my mother, "Your father's okay." And it became clear over the next few hours that, as many of you remember, there was a very organized attack in Mumbai, India, and I believe 12 different locations. The Taj Mahal Hotel, the Ambria Hotel, the train stations, the Chabad. Unfortunately, the rabbi and his wife were killed in the Chabad. And a very, very coordinated attack. And my father used to stay at the Ambria Hotel. And anybody who was upstairs in their room, if you stayed upstairs in your room, you were fine. But if you were downstairs in the lobby of the hotel, when the gunman came in, and in particular if you had a white complexion, and in particular if you were wearing a yarmulke, your likelihood of survival was very, very, very small. And my father was standing there with a yarmulke with 2 other Jewish people, another one with a yarmulke as well, in the lobby of the hotel. And they didn't have to check out for like another hour. And my understanding is the Mumbai airport is not the kind of place you want to just hang out in, at least at that time. And there was another gentleman my father was with who lived in Israel, and he had this feeling and he said, "I want to get out of here." And they left the hotel. They didn't even check out. They just took their bags, went into a taxi. And later my father realized that he actually saw the gunman walking in front of his taxi. That's how close he was to the attack. The next night was Thanksgiving. And not to get involved in whether Jews should celebrate Thanksgiving or not. And in my family, we didn't do it religiously for sure. But since then, it became a religious holiday, Thanksgiving. A Sudat Hoda, a celebration of Thanksgiving. And it's very fitting that the next speaker in a few minutes is going to be Rabbi Klatzko. Because 24 hours after that Thanksgiving, that Friday night, Emet had its first major Shabbaton by Rabbi Klatzko's home, and it was the first major Shabbaton ever by Rabbi Klatzko's home after he had a fire in his house and they rebuilt the house. And I found myself literally 48 hours after this happened to my father, sitting in Rabbi Klatzko's dining room with 70 Emet students, 100 people in the dining room, and plenty of room for everyone to sit. And I looked at the very short chapter in Tehillim called Mizmor LeTodah, a psalm of thanksgiving. And we say this chapter when we're saved from a danger. We say this chapter in the time of the Beit HaMikdash when you brought a korban todah, a sacrifice of thanksgiving, which, by the way, the commentaries tell us that when Mashiach comes and all the korbanot are going to be different, korban todah will still remain. And a korban todah was a very special thing. A person would bring it when they were saved from a danger, when they made it across an ocean, when they made it out of an illness, when they got out of jail. and there's special chalot and matzot that you're supposed to have, and it forces you to share this korban with so many different people. And I look at this very short chapter that I say every day of the week, except Shabbat, and it spoke to me differently than it ever did before. And I see the words, Mizmor l'todah, a psalm of thanksgiving. Hariu la Hashem kol haaretz, I call out to Hashem, to the whole world. Ivdu et Hashem b'simcha, ba'u lefanav birnana. Serve God with joy, come before Him with even a higher level of joy. You know, there's so many words in biblical Hebrew for happiness and joy. Some want to say that similar to the way the Eskimos have words to describe snow, we have words to describe simcha. In the bracha that Chatan and Kala say, in the seventh bracha we give to the Chatan and Kala, we say, Gila rina ditza v'chedva hava ve'achva v'shalom v'reyut. I'm not going to try to translate that right here, but each one is a different level of happiness and joy. The Mizmor l'Todah starts off and it says, Ivdu et Hashem b'simcha, serve God with joy, ba'u lefanav birnana, come before Him with even a higher level of joy. And the obvious question that I ask myself, both as a therapist and as a rabbi and as a thoughtful person, I think everyone needs to ask themselves this question: how does Hashem command me to have an emotion? Simcha is an emotion. How do you tell a person to feel something? Either I feel it or I don't feel it. You can't tell me to have an emotion. And then I look at the next word, and I don't believe in the entire Tehillim, David uses this word, and he says, Du'u, you should know. And what is the next line he says? Ki Hashem hu Elokim, hu asanu v'lo anachnu. And I believe David HaMelech is teaching us something very, very powerful, which goes very much against so much of what our society says. And that is that simcha, happiness, is not something that you need to arrive at that point. You don't have to work on yourself to become happy. You don't have to have everything going right to be happy. Happiness is actually your natural state. Now, how can I tell you this? What does that mean, happiness is your natural state? What I'm saying is that there's two main reasons that a person's not happy. One is because things are not going the way they want. They think they should be worth this much, they're worth that much. They think their kids should be respecting them this way, and they're not. They think that things are not going the way they want. And the second is because they feel lonely and disconnected. And on that, David HaMelech is saying, Du'u, ki Hashem hu ha'elokim. Hashem, we know, is midas ha'chesed. Elokim is midas hadin. When we say on Yom Kippur, Hashem hu elokim, what does that mean? It means we are saying that everything in our life is chesed. What looks like judgment is really chesed. Everything is chesed. Hu asanu v'lo anachnu. He created us. We are part of Him. Amo v'tzon marito. We're the flock of His sheep. If you think about the animal that's the most relaxed, it's the sheep, because he's protected by the shepherd. I haven't spoken to a farmer recently, but I never heard of sheep needing to be on Xanax, because they're protected. If we incorporate these two ideas, David HaMelech says, you're automatically going to be besimcha. You're going to be happy. But then I ask myself another question. Why here? Why now? David HaMelech went through so much tragedies in his life. Why at this point, when he's saved from a danger, is he talking about simcha? It's natural to be simcha when you make it out of jail, when you make it across the ocean. Why over here does David HaMelech have to talk to me about simcha? And I think the idea is because what David is teaching us is that gratitude and simcha are directly connected. Mizmor l'Todah, a psalm of thanksgiving, Ivdu et Hashem b'simcha. Gratitude and simcha are directly tied to each other. If I can be a person that trains myself to be grateful about all the blessings of my life, I will automatically be in a state of simcha. What I would like to suggest is that there's a triangle. There's gratitude, there's simcha, and then there's the chibur, there's the connection that we have with Hashem and with our mitzvot. It's brought down in the name of the Orchas Tzadikim that if a person does a mitzvah with simcha, there's 1,000 times greater reward for that mitzvah than a mitzvah not done b'simcha. The Arizal HaKadosh says that the way I became who I became was not because I did mitzvahs better than anyone else, but I did it with more simcha. After I came up with this idea, I actually saw that Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, the founder of the Musar movement, once said that the reason that children are happier than adults is not because of what we think, that they're naive, but rather nobody taught them not to be happy. Adults, and as we grow up, we're told, oh, this is not going right. You lost your job. You can't be happy today. This went wrong. You can't be happy today. This went wrong. But in essence, and B'ezrat Hashem, if I have more time in the future, I'll elaborate more on this idea. There's an attitude of gratitude that's essential to us as a human being, to being besimcha, to being happy. And if we can create this attitude of gratitude in ourselves, then the way we do mitzvahs is totally different. When I do a mitzvah besimcha, I am mechubar to that mitzvah. I'm connected to the mitzvah. The mitzvah is coming from me. It's not just something that I'm doing. And when I do that mitzvah, my children and others around and community members, everybody will want to be connected to that because it's real and it's connected. Think about our relationship, as Rabbi Klatzko often talks about. Everything in our relationship with Hashem is just it's a relationship. Think about our relationships with our spouse, with each other. These three ingredients are the key: gratitude, simcha, and connection. If you want to have a very healthy relationship with your spouse, figure out ways, look for ways to feel that gratitude. Feel gratitude in everything that you do. And that brings you to simcha. And then your relationship that's built on gratitude and simcha will be a relationship of connection that will be very, very hard to break away from that. Moshe Feinstein, the great sage of the 20th century, very famously in many, many different essays, is bothered by a question. He says, I don't understand. He lived on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and he saw countless Jews who sacrificed so much for mitzvot, and their own children and grandchildren just went away in droves. And he said, I don't understand. They did so much sacrifice for Torah. Why did their children not continue it? And if Moshe didn't say it, I don't think I could say it. But Moshe said the problem was because they said, it's schwer zu sein a Yid. It's hard to be a Jew. And Moshe wasn't blaming them for saying that, but he was explaining the consequence of saying that. Because if that father would have sat down on his chair Friday night and said, it's hard to be a Jew, but it's so, so worth it, then that simcha would have been something that would be able to continue for generations. But when the children saw, it's difficult for my father, I have such respect for him, but why do I want that life? And if I might suggest, and I don't mean to be controversial here, but I might suggest, in our own lives, we may also be doing schwer zu sein a Yid. We may also be saying to ourselves and our children, it's hard to be a Jew, without recognizing that we're saying it. When we're in our families and we talk about how difficult tuition is, how difficult this is, and they're all difficult, don't get me wrong. But when we talk about all the difficulties, at some subtle point, I think the message gets sent that it's hard. And I think that if we can train ourselves to have an attitude of gratitude, it will make all the difference. I'm going to end with the Hebrew word for hakarat hatov, right? When we say the word gratitude in Hebrew, what do we say? Hakarat hatov. If you look at the word, it doesn't mean what we think it means. It doesn't say gratitude. It says recognizing the good. We know there's something called kafu tov. Kafu tov is when someone does something for you and you're disrespectful. You don't recognize them. Most of us think there's kafu tov and there's hakarat hatov. And that's it. There's two things. I don't think this is true. I think that there's kafu tov, and then that's a person who doesn't recognize the good. And then there's being a decent human being, which is recognizing the good. That's not hakarat hatov. Hakarat hatov is recognizing the good. Seeing the good even when the situation doesn't look so pretty. Finding the good in the difficult moments. And if a person trains himself to do that, they can be in a state of tremendous simcha all their life. When the last bracha of Birchat HaMazon is the bracha hatova hametiv, the one who does good and is good. And if I asked you, where is the source of that bracha? Where did the Chachamim come up with that bracha? You would probably tell me, in the time of Shlomo HaMelech, the Jews controlled the whole world. No, that's not the source. The source is actually an event that happened today. The city of Beitar was taken over. And the Gemara talks about how much blood flowed from that city for a long time after the event. So you ask me, so why are they making a bracha hatova hametiv? And the Gemara tells us because they were not able to have a proper burial. But months later when they came back, Hashem made a miracle and their bodies were intact and they were able to have a proper burial. Does that make sense? That's what we're giving thanks for. And I would suggest that yes, that's what we're giving thanks for, because they were able to be makar tov, accept for whatever reason why this tragedy had to happen, and yet see Hashem's hand in the good that they were able to have that burial. And it's interesting today, when do we make a bracha hatova hametiv? We make a bracha when you have one wine on the table, and somebody brings you another wine which is better. You like it better. You have a Chardonnay on the table, and somebody brings you the Merlot that you like better. And we make a bracha hatova hametiv. And I would like to suggest, what's the connection between that bracha and the city of Beitar? And I think the answer is that if we want to be the type of people that can be makar tov, that can have an attitude of gratitude even in the most difficult moments, we need to be able to be people that appreciate the Merlot over the Cabernet, over the other wine. That we can appreciate every nuance of good in our life. And I also want to suggest that I think sometimes the internet and the way that news travels today, we can end up becoming a society where we're only talking about tragedies. And although it's beautiful in a way, something bad happens and the whole Jewish people are talking about this beautiful achdut, unity, but there's a little bit of a negative that I think we have to be careful from. That we don't become so focused on negative and sadness, because when somebody has a miraculous situation, very often it doesn't travel anything near as fast as the tragedy. And we end up having this attitude that life is terrible, there's so many problems, and there are definitely problems. But we need to train ourselves to appreciate the good, to appreciate all the bracha in our life. And if we could work on ourselves to serve Hashem b'simcha, to serve Hashem with joy, to fill our lives with gratitude and joy, we will have a chibur, we'll have a connection to the mitzvot that Bezrat Hashem will bring us to Beit HaMikdash.